So, listen to this. There was a player who had everything football dreams are made of. The strength, the speed, the technique, the moments that make crowds rise and commentators lose their voices. He played for the biggest clubs, stood on the brightest stages, and experienced the kind of career most players spend their entire lives chasing. And yet, somehow, it never looked like he actually wanted any of it. Not the fame, not the expectations, not even the success itself. While everyone else was desperate to become something greater, he moved through it all like it didn't belong to him. And that's why, years later, people still call him a wasted talent. But what if that was never the truth? At first, Mario Balotelli's story looks simple. A talented player who had the world at his feet and somehow let it slip away. A career full of promise that never quite became what it was supposed to be. That's the version most people remember. The easy explanation that fits neatly into how football usually works. But the deeper you look, the less convincing that version becomes. Because this isn't really a story about wasted talent or bad decisions or even inconsistency. It's about something far more uncomfortable. It's about a player who never truly connected with the world he was placed in. A system that demanded discipline, obedience and control, and a personality that resisted all of it. And once you start seeing it that way, everything changes. Because suddenly, Balotelli doesn't look like a failure. He looks like someone who was never meant to play the game the way everyone else did. Long before the headlines, before the controversies, before the version of Mario Balotelli that the world thought it understood, there was already something different about him. Because he wasn't just another talented kid rising through the system. He was someone who never fully belonged to it in the first place. Born in Italy to Ghanaian parents and adopted at a young age, his story started with a quiet sense of disconnection. A feeling of being present but never completely accepted. And maybe that feeling never really left him. But then football entered the picture, and suddenly everything changed. Because on the pitch, he wasn't different in a way that made him stand out awkwardly. He was different in a way that made him impossible to ignore. Stronger than players his age, technically gifted, fearless in moments where others hesitated, carrying himself with a kind of natural confidence that didn't need validation. And as coaches noticed it and scouts noticed it, it didn't take long before one of the biggest clubs in Italy brought him into their system. At Inter Milan, surrounded by structure, discipline and expectation, Balotelli looked like the future. A young player with the physical presence of a veteran and the talent to become something extraordinary. But even then, beneath the performances and the promise, there were small signs that something didn't quite align. Because he followed the path, but not in the way others did. He played the game, but never fully seemed to embrace everything that came with it. And at the time, no one really questioned it. Because talent has a way of hiding deeper problems, at least for a while. But then the environment around him started to change, and that's where everything became more complicated. Because at Inter Milan, Balotelli was no longer just another young talent. He was now part of a system built on discipline, hierarchy and control, especially under a manager like Jose Mourinho. And Mourinho wasn't the kind of coach who adjusted to players. He expected players to adjust to him, where structure came first, authority came first, and anything that didn't fit into that was treated as a problem to be solved. At least, that's how it worked for most players. But Balotelli was never like most players. From the outside, it looked like a simple clash. A young, unpredictable talent refusing to follow instructions, and a coach demanding total obedience. with training ground incidents, visible frustration, and moments where his body language spoke louder than his performances, forming a narrative that football has seen many times before. A gifted player without the right attitude, slowly wasting himself. But the more these moments repeated, the more it became clear that this wasn't just immaturity. It was something deeper. Because Balotelli didn't react like someone trying and failing to meet expectations. He reacted like someone who never fully accepted them in the first place. Carrying a distance in the way he moved, a refusal to engage emotionally with the structures around him, as if he was participating in the system without ever believing in it. And that tension didn't disappear when he moved to Manchester City. If anything, it became louder. Because at City, under Roberto Mancini, Balotelli experienced both extremes at the same time. Moments of brilliance that reminded everyone why he was so highly rated. Goals that felt effortless. Flashes of genius that could change games in seconds. And right next to those moments, chaos. Arguments in training, unpredictable decisions, situations that didn't make sense if you tried to view him through the lens of a typical professional player. And that's where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Because players who don't care don't produce moments like that. And players who lack ability don't reach that level. Yet Balotelli existed in a strange space where he could look unstoppable one week and completely disconnected the next. Not because he couldn't perform, but because something about the environment around him never seemed to hold him in place. And as the media began to focus more on his behavior than his football, the story slowly shifted. He was no longer seen as a future star, but as a problem, a headline, a personality that overshadowed everything else. But the real story was just beginning. And once you start looking at Balotelli's career through that lens, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because the story wasn't built on one or two isolated incidents. It repeated itself over and over again across different clubs, different managers, and different stages of his career. Almost as if the outcome had already been written before it even began. At Inter Milan, under Mourinho, a manager known for extracting everything from his players, Balotelli still managed to exist outside of that control. And there was a moment Mourinho once described where, during a Champions League game, with no strikers available on the bench, Balotelli was the only attacking option left. Yet he was already on a yellow card, already making risky decisions, already behaving in a way that forced his own manager to consider taking him off, despite having no alternatives. And in that moment, it wasn't just about ability or discipline, it was about trust. Because even one of the best managers in the world didn't fully trust him to stay within the boundaries required. But then, just when it seemed like the narrative was settling into something negative, Balotelli would remind everyone why he was different. Because talent like his doesn't disappear, it resurfaces. And at Manchester City, those flashes became even more visible, as he scored goals that looked effortless, movements that felt instinctive rather than coached, moments that broke games open without warning. And then came one of the most iconic scenes of his career, the "Why always me" moment. A goal against Manchester United, followed by a calm celebration and a message revealed under his shirt that instantly became part of football culture, which to some looked arrogant, and to others, felt like frustration. But either way, showed something deeper. Because he wasn't trying to fit into the narrative, he was reacting to it. And yet, even in that same season, the contradictions continued. Because Balotelli wasn't just a symbol of chaos, he was also directly involved in one of the most important moments in Manchester City's history. The final game of the 2011-12 season, with the title on the line and time almost gone. Where, in the middle of all that pressure and expectation, it was Balotelli who provided the assist to Sergio Aguero's last-second goal. A single pass that seemed simple on the surface, but was decisive in one of the most dramatic finishes the league had ever seen. And that's where things become difficult to explain. Because how do you define a player who can be both unreliable and essential at the exact same time? How do you categorize someone who can drift through matches without impact and then suddenly decide the outcome of a title race? Because the usual explanations don't hold. Since if it was about ability, the evidence contradicts it. And if it was about mentality in the traditional sense, the pattern still doesn't fully make sense. Because players who lack focus don't show up in decisive moments like that. They don't deliver under pressure. They don't create defining contributions in games that matter. So the problem wasn't that he couldn't do it, it was that he didn't do it consistently. And in modern football, consistency is everything. As the years went on, the pattern followed him, from AC Milan to Liverpool to Nice to Marseille, with different environments and expectations, but the same underlying tension. Moments where he looked like he was rediscovering himself, followed by periods where he seemed disconnected again. Not a straight decline, but a cycle of rise, doubt, resurgence and collapse, repeating over and over again. And with each cycle, the narrative became stronger. As the media simplified it, fans repeated it, and Balotelli was labelled as someone who didn't care, someone who wasted what he was given, someone who could have been great if only he had the right mindset. And over time, that version of the story became dominant, because it was easier to understand and fit the structure people were used to. But there was one problem, because that explanation only works if you assume that every player is trying to play the same game. And the more you look at Balotelli, the harder it becomes to believe that he ever was. And that's where everything starts to shift. Because for years the story around him had always been told in the same way. A player who had everything and somehow threw it away. A career that could have been legendary reduced to moments instead of sustained greatness. A narrative that feels logical because it suggests the outcome was within his control. But what if that's the wrong way to look at it? What if Balotelli didn't sabotage his career, but simply refused to become what football expected him to be? Because success in modern football isn't just about talent, it's about fitting into a system that rewards discipline, repetition, and predictability. Where players are expected to follow structures, respond to authority, and maintain control even under pressure. And Balotelli never fully did that. Not because he couldn't, but because something in him resisted it, always carrying a distance, as if he was playing the game without accepting all of its rules. And in a system built on consistency, that kind of unpredictability becomes something that has to be removed. So instead of adapting to him, football moved on. And once you see it that way, the story changes completely. Because he no longer looks like a failure. He looks like someone who never agreed with the path required to stay at the top. zoom out, his story feels less like an exception and more like a reflection of how modern football actually works. Because at the highest level, football isn't just about skill, but about structure. Systems designed where every movement is calculated and every role defined. Where coaches look not just for talent, but for reliability. For players who can repeat the same decisions again and again. Because consistency isn't just valued, it's required. And in that environment, individuality becomes complicated. Not the kind that works within the system, but the kind that exists outside of it. The kind that doesn't follow patterns or respond predictably. Because football ultimately rewards control. Control over the ball, over space, and over people. Shaping players to fit into structure. Rewarding those who adapt and removing those who don't. And players like Balotelli exist in a different space. Not better or worse, but incompatible. Because when a player operates on instinct rather than repetition, the system doesn't know how to handle it, and eventually stops trying, shifting the conversation away from the system and onto the player, until the system itself disappears from the discussion entirely. And maybe that's why the moments that define him feel so different. Because when he did connect with the game, it wasn't controlled or predictable. It was instinctive and raw. Like that night at Euro 2012 against Germany, where in the middle of structure and preparation, he produced something that felt disconnected from everything around him. 2 goals taken with pure belief, followed by that iconic celebration, standing still with no visible emotion. Not joy, not relief, just presence. And maybe that's the closest we ever came to understanding him. Because in that moment, there was no noise, no expectations, just alignment between player and game. But moments like that didn't last. Not because they couldn't, but because everything around them required something else. And maybe that's why his story still feels unfinished. Because it doesn't fit into the way football explains success and failure, leaving behind a possibility that not every player is meant to follow the same path. That talent alone isn't always enough. Not because it lacks quality, but because it doesn't align with what the system demands. And that sometimes the difference between greatness and disappointment isn't ability, but compatibility. Because Balotelli had the moments, the goals, the evidence. But maybe he was never trying to become what football wanted him to be. And in a game that rewards control and predictability, that might have been the one thing he could never give. So maybe he didn't waste his talent. Maybe he just refused to belong to a game that never fully understood him.